Great. Okay, Jason?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Zelesky, and I'm pleased to be with all of you this morning. Looks like we have really solid attendance for a Monday morning webinar, so I thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us. If you are on the phone and calling in, if you haven't muted your phone yet, we can hear some folks in the background typing away. If you could mute your phone so that folks on the call are not hearing what you're doing, always prevents a potentially embarrassing situation from happening on your end. So if you could do that, that would be great. Just a brief introduction of who I am as we get started. I've been working in student affairs for 25 years. I am currently the Interim Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students at Mount Wachusett Community College, and I'll talk to you a little bit about our population of students and who we are in just a little bit. But in that time working with college students in student affairs, I've had a particular emphasis on student health promotion, substance use prevention, and sexual assault prevention. I was fortunate enough about 15 years ago to be on a Department of Justice grant, working at my previous institution, Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And that grant allowed us to be one of the first campuses to really audit our policies around sexual violence and sexual misconduct. We were one of the first campuses in the country to establish a sexual misconduct hearing board, aside from our typical college conduct board. And we worked very closely with the University of New Hampshire to institute a bystander prevention and affirmative consent program. So I also served very recently, and it's certainly applicable to the webinar that we're going to go through today, on a national board to explore the development of sexual assault prevention programming for commuter and community college and non-traditional students. So we recognized that there really was a lack of programming, particularly for non-traditional commuter graduate students around sexual violence education and programming. So for a year, a small group of us from across the United States served on a policy and programming board to develop some best practices around prevention programming. And I'm going to talk with all of you a little bit about what we came up with throughout that planning and programming process. So let me grab control here and we'll get started. I just wanted to include a couple of quick slides just to give us some context. I think this is important. It's actually important in the programming that I do on my campus. Whenever we have an opportunity to do our programming, which is a year-long set of programs, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that calendar looks like on our campus. But I think it's important that we let students also know what the context is for why we're doing what we're doing right now. And while we don't spend a whole lot of time on the history, we do spend some time talking with our students about how they fit into sort of the context of sexual violence education and programming. And I won't go through most of the folks on the call probably are familiar with this history, but I think it's important, again, just to remember that where we are today is part of a developmental process in and of itself. And again, we can look at, for example, the second wave, the civil rights movement with Rosa Parks and the Committee for Equal Justice. We did some programming this year around Recy Taylor. And for folks who may not be aware, there is a very good Netflix film currently out that documents the life and the traumatic incident that really started the Committee for Equal Justice, which looked at assisting women of color and reclaiming their bodies against sexual violence and interracial rape. So we've done some programming on our campus to really talk about how the civil rights movement combined in some of the efforts around sexual violence prevention and programming. You can see there on the third wave in the 1970s, we have included in some of our curriculum and fusion work Susan Brown-Miller's Against Our Will, which was a book that really, for the first time, talked about systemic violence and the culture of fear that many women in the country at the time felt around sexual violence. And then you can see, again, from a college perspective, the University of Maryland establishing the first campus rape crisis center on a college campus in 1972. So it's a basic timeline of what we're talking about, and I'm just going to go into sort of where we are today. And some folks would say that we're in the fourth wave. Other folks would say that we're starting sort of a fifth wave, and we could certainly talk a little bit about that. I'm going to pause just for 1 second because I forgot to mention in my introduction around questions. So as Josie mentioned, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. I'm going to do my best to try to do 5 things at once and read through my notes and the slides and think about what I'm talking about, but also pay attention to that chat box. So if the spirit moves you and there's something that I'm saying that you want to jump on with a question, please go ahead and do that. And if I see it, I will try to circle to it. If not, we're going to leave plenty of time at the end of our webinar to answer any questions from all of you that you have. So I will keep track of time and make sure that we're stopping around 10:45, 10:50 to handle any questions that folks may have. So again, the fourth wave, which is sort of where we are, which is pretty compliance-based. So whether that's the Clery Act, VAWA, sort of the compliance issues around the Dear Colleague letter, and some of the negotiated rulemaking that is really underway as we speak. Colleges and universities have shifted gears in many different ways to either enhance existing programming or, for some folks on some college campuses, really starting their programming within the last 10 years. And I'll say, full disclosure, Mount Wachusett Community College just started their robust prevention programming that we're going to talk about today 5 years ago. That was also the time that I arrived at Mount Wachusett. And my background is so for 20 years I worked on primarily residential college campuses, working primarily with traditional age 18 to 22-year-old students. When I arrived at Mount Wachusett, which is non-residential, entirely commuter-based, the average age of our student is 27.8. They were not doing the type of programming that we were obligated to do, required by law to do, both on the state of Massachusetts, but also according to Dear Colleague and VAWA in terms of prevention education. And a lot of that was because we did not have staff here on campus that were comfortable doing this work, and we didn't have a whole lot of work to take a look at. So there weren't a lot of paradigms or archetypes of programming for non-traditional students for Mount Wachusett to look at. So we've been building our program. And I think for a lot of, when I do webinars or speak at conferences, a lot of folks, colleges and universities, particularly those that are commuter-based, are really nervous about admitting that what they're doing right now is not enough, or maybe that they're not doing anything at all. And my recommendation, if that's the case for you or for the colleges that you work with, that the first step is to admit that you're going to do something and begin that process, and not be embarrassed by the fact that you haven't started yet. I have worked with a lot of campuses who are really just getting started doing this work. And what we're starting to see now is both an expansion of Title IX and the start of statewide initiatives. And certainly in New York, with the Enough is Enough law and programming that's embedded in that law, that's one certain example of what's happening state to state. Massachusetts, just as a point of reference, is really just beginning to create some fidelity around language, policy, and programming. In fact, we're looking at some recommendations from our general counsel right now for the start of a campus climate survey, which I know is part of the Enough is Enough law for folks in New York. So just briefly, this is the history that I'm sure you're aware of with Enough is Enough. But again, relatively new when you look at the contextual timeline that we just took a look at, July 2015. But it is a commitment, and it's a statewide commitment that college students in New York have a right to a safe, healthy, and nurturing campus environment. And just that statement alone certainly has tremendous impact for students who are arriving on a college campus. And while that may be ceremonial, it is very symbolic to have that strong language across the entire state. But Enough is Enough does stand as a model for colleges and universities across the country because it does look to implement uniform prevention and response policies related to sexual assault, dating violence, and interpersonal violence, domestic violence, and stalking. And again, the key terms are highlighted there in yellow, but we're looking at things like affirmative consent, amnesty policies, a student bill of rights. What can students expect on a college campus from the college itself? Campus climate assessments, which we will certainly talk about, prevention training requirements, and also, and very importantly, the establishment of a campus sexual assault victims unit, and also creating a pool of funding to support programming and prevention efforts. I've certainly worked with lots of states, and it's never enough money or never enough funding, but certainly have worked with lots of state entities, both nonprofit prevention folks and college campuses who are faced with unfunded mandates from their legislators. So it's nice to see that New York has invested at least some funding in trying to make sure that these programs are happening. So I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about today's college student, and we're going to focus today on students who may not be living on campus, and that may be folks that did live on campus, traditional age students who have since moved off campus. We may be talking about commuters who just simply make a choice to either live at home or live in their own residence versus coming on to campus. But we also may be talking about non-traditional students. But if we take a look at today's traditional age student, commonly referred to now as Generation Z, I think it's important that we just take a look at developmentally the type of student that we're working with. So their primary influencers are advances in technology. So our students today, are certainly our traditional age students today, are adept at using technology, and most of them are using multiple modalities of technology, and they are using technology just about every way to do just about everything. And I'm going to talk about why that's important for us when we're building our prevention programs in a few minutes. They are influenced by violence, and we could spend hours just unpacking this one bullet. But the point of this particular sort of influencer is that today's student is growing up in a world that they perceive to be as unsafe. So these are our traditional age students that are coming to our campus have not gone to school thinking of school as a safe place. And while that may be difficult for Gen Xers, millennials, boomers to hear, that is a true statement for our students. So they're always skeptical of environments, and they're focused and thinking about what you're going to do to make their community, workplace, residence hall, college campus safe. because that's instruction and training that they have been receiving their entire lives. They're coming to us from a volatile economy, so they're nervous, they're stressed. They have about 2/3 of today's traditional age student have lived through either their parents being laid off or a close friend's parents being laid off, and have experienced sort of viscerally what it feels like to be sort of economically dissettled. And then lastly, social justice movements are sort of commonplace for this generation, and that includes Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, Occupy Wall Street. Our students are passionate about those movements. They're connected to them. They've used technology to be connected to them even when they're happening across the world. Our students are paying attention to the transformative movements that are happening all around them, and they're involved in that. And that may be very different than, for example, my generation was involved. That meant showing up. That meant making a sign and physically showing up. For our students, they feel that involvement, whether they're physically showing up or they're showing up in social media or in technology. They can access those social movements in a number of different ways. So just to give you a sense of sort of the self-reporting of this generation of traditional age students, they're more diverse than ever before. We talked about the fact that they're more economically challenged. They're more connected, but they're also more disconnected. And I'll talk about that in a second. They're more anxious, overwhelmed, and distracted. And one of the things that I think is important for us to know as prevention folks is that the average attention span of a Generation Z student is 8 seconds, which is down from 12 seconds for their millennial counterparts. And just to put that into further context, the attention span of a goldfish is 9 seconds. So this generation's attention span is actually less than a goldfish. So and I say that half joking and half serious, because as folks that are building programs, it's important that we realize that we are trying to get the attention of students who are so distracted, and there's very little that we can do to stop that distraction. And just to give you a couple of more examples, and I'm happy to share this information with folks after the webinar. But in 1 minute, in 2018, and this is true for all of us, not just our college students, it's really true for everyone. This is what happens in 1 minute on the internet in 2018. There are 18 million text messages sent, 4.3 million YouTube videos watched, 481,000 tweets, 1.1 million swipes on Tinder, 187 emails sent, 38 million phone or text messages on iChat, 2.4 million Snapchats are created, and over almost 300,000 hours of Netflix is watched. And that's in 1 minute. And almost $900,000 is spent online in 1 minute. So our students are able to do things that quite frankly, some of us don't even understand. And they're doing it in a short amount of time. Our students are also more lonely. The American College Health Association just did a quick survey that in the last 12 months, this is of college students, that in their last 12 months, 86% of our college students felt overwhelmed, 59% said that they were lonely, 42% said that they were hopeless, 54% said they had overwhelming, debilitating anxiety, and 32% said that they were so depressed that it was difficult to function. But students are also more active on social issues. They're more socially liberal. They're fewer in number, and those of us who are working on college campuses know that that demographic shift is going to be with us until probably the year 2030 before we start to see a little bit of an uptick in the amount of students that are coming to college. And then they're less experienced. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because what the data and the research is showing us right now is that our students are actually coming to us because of how they're living and how they're developing, particularly around technology, how they're interacting with one another, that students are starting to come to our college campuses less sexually experienced, having used less drugs and alcohol, or we're seeing more and more students who have not yet experienced or have had experience experimenting with drugs or alcohol. They're coming to us from families that are smaller, just in number, which means that many of our students are coming with some restrictive parenting. So they're telling us that they have not had a lot of opportunities to make their own decisions around time management, executive functioning, choice, selection, because parents have been pretty vigilant around making some of those decisions for them. And so it's important that we know that that's a shift. That has not been true for the last 15 or 20 years. We're starting to see students with less experience. And all of us know, and I've long been an advocate, that folks that work with college students, student affairs prevention folks, have to have sort of a minor degree in neuroscience because it's important that we know how our students' brains are working. And technology is starting to impact and delay brain development. And we already know that many of our students come to us without their brains being fully developed, and that the last part of that development is that prefrontal lobe, which controls judgment, empathy, and impulse control. And when we're talking about the type of prevention work that we're looking to show some impact on, the fact that our students are coming to us having being already challenged around impulse control, judgment, and empathy makes our challenge even greater. However, and this is becoming more and more true with that internet minute and sort of that instant gratification that our students are experiencing every second of every day, research is starting to show us that the temporal lobe of our students' brains are fully developed, and that controls the brain's desire for reward, emotion, sensation, and novelty seeking. So you can see from a neuroscience perspective, and again, this is an oversimplification from an English major and a student affairs professional. I'm not a neuroscientist, but if you take a look at just that just basic research, you have the recipe for a perfect storm when it comes to the prevention work. And if you add on top of that our students are more disconnected from one another, and that interpersonal communication is becoming more and more challenged for our students, we're then bringing them onto a college campus in a residential environment. It may be the first time that they're really interacting with one another on that level, with that level of intimacy. And our commuter students are trying to access those relational connections with even less support and scaffolding for them. So that's just a little sort of context for who our students are. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the community college landscape. I'm not sure of the 37 folks that we have registered today how relevant that is, except to really look at it in the aggregate. To realize that if we look at the data of who is going to college, not just community colleges, but in general, that 51%, so the majority of today's college students actually fit into that non-traditional, quote-unquote, bucket. So it's almost time for us to really shift that language or find new language, because the non-traditional student, so the student that doesn't fall into that 18 to 22-year-old age group, is actually in the majority. So it's important that when we're talking about prevention work, that we're also considering the fact that we're not just trying to reach the 18 to 22-year-old population. And how they access and do college is very different than our non-traditional or commuter populations. And we just need to pay attention to that. And that seems like that should be sort of an automatic, but it hasn't been. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the newer strategies for reaching our non-traditional students. Community college campuses, and this is true for maybe some folks on the call as well, have open access admission. So we don't really, if you're qualified to be here at Mount Wachusett at the community college level, you're accepted. And that means that we have an incredible spectrum of diversity with our students. And that means we have students who have been incarcerated. We have honor students. We have high school students. Currently right now on our campus, my students range, I just checked this morning in advance of this webinar, my youngest student is 15, my oldest student is 83, and they could be in the same class together. And so it's important as we think about orientation and messaging and programming that we're thinking along those lines. And some of you may not be looking at that type of extreme in terms of the breadth of the ages of your students, but it's important to remind yourself that students are are coming on that spectrum. We also need to recognize that our students do have disparate needs. Not every student needs the same thing, and that we have online students or students who have limited access to our campus community, and we'll certainly talk a little bit about that. And on our campus, and this is true of the SUNY campuses, you're talking about multiple campus locations. So how do you reach folks that are accessing campuses that are different, have different resources, have different amenities, and paying close attention and making sure that you're paying attention to those things as well. And that's just a quick slide just to give folks a sense of what my campus looks like. And I think it's pretty typical of a community college campus at Mount Wachusett. One of the things that I do want to highlight here when we're talking about prevention work that can be a challenge on some campuses, and that is that it is on community college campuses, and this is true across the country, not all community college campuses are staffed with folks who are traditional higher education folks. Not all community colleges will have resources like health centers or counseling centers. In fact, many community colleges, much to my chagrin, are actually outsourcing counseling services to an online platform or an online referral platform. And if we just take a second to reflect back on the demographic information that I just shared, our students need more human interaction and more relational interaction than ever before. That's just fact. So as college campuses look to consolidate resources and put them online in terms of those types of relational support services, I think we're gonna find that students are going to become even more disconnected and even less likely to make that outreach. So here at Mount Wachusett, we only have 2 staff members out of 70 who have traditional higher ed backgrounds. So when we started this prevention work, one of the things that we had to address openly and honestly is that a lot of folks on my staff were very uncomfortable doing sexual violence prevention work. And we were all over the map, so to speak, in terms of our knowledge and our understanding of these issues and how they were impacting not just our college community, but the community that we were living in here in north central Massachusetts. And 80% of our students have significant need. They're either Pell eligible, first generation, or have a documented disability, and some fit multiple categories. So opportunities for community colleges, and again for all colleges, one of the ways we approach our prevention work is that we have an opportunity to make a tremendous impact in a resource-limited area. So we consider ourselves to be the thought leader on sexual violence prevention and violence prevention in general, not just on our campus, but in entire 29 cities and towns that we serve. And we are the second poorest region in Massachusetts. There are 15 community colleges in our state, and we are the second poorest in terms of our catchment area. So we've made a deliberate commitment that not only are we going to work to educate the students on our campus, but we know we're serving our communities. So at any point in time, anyone in our community can become our student. So we're doing work in our communities. We're doing work with our social service agencies, with our veterans groups. We're going into our high schools and middle schools. We're taking our programming to those folks and trying to intersect our communities in a number of different ways so that when they arrive on our campus, the messaging that they're hearing, the prevention message they're hearing, is one that they're already familiar with. They've heard some of the things that we're talking about, in particular our commitment to creating safe, inclusive communities. And that's been extremely helpful at getting buy-in from our students. Some additional challenges that we and all of us really have to consider if we're talking about commuter students and non-traditional students is that we may be talking about a high-risk and vulnerable population. And one of the things that we did, and we'll talk a little bit about data collection in a moment, but we actually took a look at who our students are. And while we do not have a statewide campus climate committee, we did do some data collection and some research on who our students are. And what we learned was 46% of our students were coming to us with a history of trauma. And so that shifted our need for professional development so that our campus began to focus on trauma-informed counseling and how to work with students who have experienced trauma. And this trauma is wide-ranging. It's trauma, it's domestic violence, it's sexual violence, it's growing up in, many of our students have grown up in foster care. Many of our students have timed out of that system. Many of our students have experienced interpersonal violence, dating violence. And so when we ask the question, essentially, can you tell us if any of these things have ever happened to you? At least 46% of our students voluntarily communicated with us that they were entering our college community with a history of trauma. And I mention that because a lot of prevention work embedded in the work, unconsciously, subconsciously often, is an understanding that no trauma has happened when they've arrived at our doorstep. And I want us to take a step back and imagine that you may be importing students who already have a history of trauma and making sure that you are being careful, deliberate, and compassionate to that reality. And making sure, and one of the things that we say in our messaging to all of our students, whether this is face-to-face programming or online programming, is that we make a statement to help build empathy. And again, that neuroscience, our students come to us not often with that empathy, sort of that empathy part of their brain fully developed, to remind them that there will be students in the room for whom this has already impacted them or is currently impacting them. So our prevention efforts need to take into account that they may be brand new to us when they arrive on our campus or arrive in our offices, but that doesn't mean they're brand new to these issues. College is not always the entry point for the discussion around violence prevention. Many campuses lack mandatory orientation sessions, or they struggle with how to get commuter or non-traditional students to those mandatory sessions. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Many of our campuses have rolling admissions, So, how do you have a mandatory orientation when new students are being welcomed onto your campus every 2 months, 3 weeks, 6 months, intersessions? How do you capture those new students to make sure that they're receiving the same messages that a typical fall first-time, full-time student might receive? And then, how do you define student? And I know that you have very strict, in New York, very strict sort of fidelity around your definitions of who a student is. And what I really mean by that is that you're incorporating really anyone who's annexing with your college and university as one of your students. So many colleges have non-credit courses. They have students who are only taking one online course as a guest student. Well, here on our campus, those are our students. And we provide the same type of outreach and opportunity for education and compliance for our mandatory education for those students as well. So we don't discount a significant portion of our population just because they're only taking one course or they're only swooping in to make up a math course at their home institution. We really try to incorporate all of those students as our students and are very intentional in the language and invitation for those students to pay attention to our programming. And then one of the things that we have worked really hard in training our staff and responsible employees on our campus is the message that Title IX cases that happen off campus that are reported to us must also be investigated. And sometimes that includes working with local law enforcement. But a lot of college communities who do not have residence halls believe they are exempt from Title IX or exempt from this work, and you're not. And so it's important that we pay attention to that too. And now, what I believe is most effective is that we make this prevention work not about compliance. And this fourth wave that I mentioned earlier with VAWA and the Dear Colleague letter and the negotiated rulemaking that really is underway, and some of the rollbacks of the Dear Colleague letter that we've seen over the last year, it's been about compliance. Those of us who are drawn to prevention work and have been doing prevention work for years know that this is mission-driven for us. We are passionate, we are committed professionals in making our campuses and our students safer. However, a lot of the language that has been guiding this work for many of us is really about compliance. It's about what campuses have to do. And for some campuses, it really is about checking boxes. They've had this mandatory training, they've offered this program, it meets the definitions embedded in some of this compliance language, and therefore they've sort of met those obligations. On our campus, we have made a decided effort for this not to be about compliance. This is about a public health concern. This is about creating safe, inclusive communities. And when we're talking about, like our campus here at Mount Wachusett, non-traditional and entirely commuter populations, we are also embedding in all of our language that sexual violence prevention education is about teaching our students how to be better students, absolutely, but also how to be better parents, siblings, partners, leaders, neighbors, activists, citizens in their community, teachers, future employees in companies. This is about training our students to be different and to think differently. This is about transformative change and not checking a box. And I think that's critical and should be a critical mission statement as folks design and redesign and evaluate their programming and prevention efforts. If it's about compliance, anyone can incorporate these programs. If it's about transformative change, I think the programming that you commit to on your campus changes. And I'll give you an example. There are lots of campuses that are doing campus climate surveys across the country. And as a consultant, I visit many of those campuses. I think it's absolutely critical to know who your students are and what is happening to them on your campus. And a campus climate survey is an incredibly effective way to get your students to tell you what their experiences on your campus are like. And I think that's sort of an important part of building your prevention efforts. However, I visited lots of campuses who do campus climate surveys every year, every other year, every 3 years. Some of them have been doing this for a long time, and they're not using that data in ways that inform their practice. So if you're doing a campus climate survey and you're asking students incredibly private questions about their experience, and you're not responding to those things systemically with either prevention practices, policy changes, then I ask you why you're doing a campus climate survey. You should be using that data every day to tailor your message, to change your culture, and to let students know that you've heard them, that you've heard them communicate to you what they want to see changed. I believe that you can deliver the same content using different examples, different voices, personas, to maintain the fidelity of your prevention efforts, while also recognizing that there is variability in the experiences within the students that you serve, in the communities that you serve. So your campus climate survey should also be asking and making sure that you understand what's happening to students off campus, what's happening to your commuter students, particularly those who are not living in maybe or commuting from traditional sort of traditional college, housing that may be right on the outskirts of campus. A lot of quote-unquote commuters live closer to campus than residence hall students do. So making sure that you're sort of making that delineation in your campus climate surveys. Other challenges to consider. Broad spectrum of student experiences I talked about with campus climate. The delivery and content of your message. How, when, and to whom. And I think this is absolutely critical for your commuter students. We have developed here at Mount Wachusett a communication plan. So we never have all of our students in one place at one time. We have 20% of our students are online students only, and they live all across the world. We have a significant veteran student population, so we have lots of students who are accessing their classes on armed force bases all around the country and internationally. So we developed a communication plan that all students receive, and that communication plan talks about the type of community that we aspire to be, the type of prevention education that we are delivering to them, and we require all students to do mandatory online training. And I don't work for this company. I'm only going to talk about the program that we use, but we currently partner with EverFi for their sexual assault prevention programming module, and that module has been recently redesigned. And this was part of that committee that I was on for the last year, so that we have a sexual violence prevention program for faculty and staff. It's an online program that our faculty and staff are required to complete. We have a program that's designed for non-traditional and commuter / community college students. And all of our students are required to take that sexual assault prevention course. And we also have a sexual assault prevention course for our dual enrollment students. And those are our students who are high school age, and who are essentially completing their high school and associate's degree on our campus, and we recognize that the experience of those students is different. And the fact that they are minors taking courses on our campus, that is a different type of experience. So their program is adjusted slightly, again, looking at those tailored messages of who your population is, to ensure that that program specifically targets that age group. And then we have one other program that we use from this same company, and it's sexual assault prevention for adult learners. So it really is looking at and is specifically tailored to students, and we've just made this decision based on our campus climate survey and the content of this particular program, that students who are 30 and over can access that particular program. And it talks about students who are parents, students who are going to school full or part-time, but also raising children, and it talks about sort of how this information can not only help them be better students, create a safer community, but also how to be better parents, and how to change the culture and also evaluate the culture that their children are growing up and into. So you can see that there's variability in our prevention programming efforts. And I see a question from Caitlin. The name of the company is Everfi, E-V-E-R-F-I. And if anyone has any questions about that and those programs, I'm happy to help you with that. And yes, this is for both students and faculty. But it's important for you to know that all of those programs are different. So the program that faculty and staff are completing is different than the program that our students are completing. And then again, our students are in different buckets as well. We have our high school age students complete a different program than our adult learners, and then we have a general program for community college students. And we often, and sometimes we'll even let our students select which course would be better for them based on who they are, because we certainly have a lot of young student parents, for example, and taking the adult learner course might be a better fit for them in terms of the types of information that they're looking for. But again, even though it's mandatory, our language is about that transformative change. And I'm happy to report that last year we had the highest completion rates for these programs in the country. Over 85% of our students have completed these programs. And when a student is onboarded at our institution, so whether that is at any point in the semester because of that rolling admission, they receive a letter from me talking about how important our prevention efforts are on our campus, and then they receive the link and information to complete these programs, and then we monitor that completion. And then the question I always get is, do you use a stick or a carrot around mandatory programming? I have a series of outreach initiatives, again, through email, to help our students complete the program. And that also includes very intentional language, sort of growth mindset language that recognizes, again, that some of our students, a lot of our students, are coming to us with trauma. So we recognize that up front. And any student who feels like this would be an emotionally difficult program for them to complete are asked to contact one of our resource specialists, who can then work with them to make sure that they're supported, that they're connected to services, and if they aren't connected to services, can make that connection here on our campus, and then we would, if appropriate, sort of waive that compliance piece. So we're certainly not looking through our prevention efforts to trigger additional trauma, and that's where that trauma-informed counseling sort of informs our prevention practice around mandatory programming, and I think that's really critical. The other thing that I want to talk about on this particular page is, again, I talked a little bit about the fact that most materials in the marketplace are geared towards traditional age, and that may be the population you're trying to reach, and that's great. But if you are wondering why you're not successful maybe reaching your non-traditional student population or your commuter population, my advice to you would be to try to tailor those programming messages around those students. And we did this very deliberately. The first year we did our prevention work 5 years ago, we sort of adapted a very traditional aged model. And a lot of the scenarios, for example, in our bystander training, were scenarios that showed little video clips that showed parties in the residence halls, or fraternity sorority parties, or referenced sort of student athletics. That's not our student, and our student gave us that feedback in the evaluation to say, I think I understand the importance behind the messaging in your programming work, but you're not speaking to us. This is not our experience. And so we took a step back and re-engineered our programming to make sure that our scenarios, that our language really was connecting with our student population. And so the sexual assault prevention online programming that we're using is 100% customizable. So we spend a lot of time on the front end customizing these programs so that the language that our students are used to hearing is all embedded in the program. That includes our policies, that includes our campus and community resources. And one of the things that we did when we started this online programming was visit all of our resources in our communities. So anyone that was providing prevention work in our communities, they're embedded in this program. So no matter where I live or no matter when I access this program, I'm able to connect to resources that are in my backyard. And again, it's important for us to do that because some of our students, even those who travel to us, could be traveling 45 minutes each way, and the resources on our campus are not the closest resources for them to access. So we make sure that we do that, and I know that Lynn has just talked about the fact that the SUNY program is also 100% customizable. So if you have that option, absolutely take advantage of making sure that you're spending some time customizing that. So let me move into best practices in the time that we have left. So one of the things that we've done is what we call blended orientation programs. And what that means is a recognition that not everyone can attend your mandatory orientation. And a lot of folks will embed their best prevention programming into their orientation, whether they do that over the summer or whether they do that right before classes begin, or both. I'm seeing a lot of campuses doing this. And one of the surreal things for me is that my son is becoming a senior. He's a junior becoming a senior, and I've been going on college tours, which is a mind-blowing experience for someone who works in student affairs, who's a dean of students and a prevention professional, to see how campuses handle this work. In some ways, I think I'm their worst nightmare. I'm the worst parent to have on a tour or in a parent orientation session. I try to keep it down, but it's hard sometimes. So those blended orientation programs are really important. What we've done here on our campus is we've created a virtual orientation. So our prevention efforts, our messaging from our president, from myself, from all of the folks here on campus, we've created a virtual version of our orientation that our students can access. And we were very intentional in designing that virtual orientation to go back to the type of student that we have today. Again, that technologically savvy, immediate gratification. Our students do not have to do that virtual orientation in one fell swoop. They can do it in chunks and pieces, so there are modules. So you can spend 15 minutes and then take a day off and complete that program. We do require them to complete it. We know when they're done with it. We also know when they're doing it. And I don't think it would be a surprise for you to know that our students, that 70% of our students who complete a virtual orientation do so between midnight and 6 in the morning. That's who our students are, and that's how they're going to access that material. But our virtual orientation allows them to do that. And for our student parents and for our students who are working full-time or part-time who can't get to our mandatory orientation sessions, it allows them to not miss anything. And so not only is that critical to our prevention efforts, it sends a critical message that all students matter, that even if you can't access our orientation, that you still matter, and we still think that this information is important for you and to you, and we want to make it available in a way that you can easily digest. And that is a culture and a mindset shift. I have lots of professionals, colleagues who push back on that and say they have to get here. They have to take the day off. They have to figure out childcare. This is where we put our resources in our orientation, and they have to get here. And there are some institutions and programs that will actually penalize students who can't make it to their orientation. And again, I'm not trying to change your culture necessarily, but I think it's important. If you think this information is important, there are multiple modalities and ways that you can get it to them so that you can, again, invest in that transformative culture change. Students today watch 11.3 hours of online video on YouTube alone. So this is a medium and modality that they are comfortable using. So if you can find a way to deliver your content, and this could be any of your prevention programs, that you could create a model program that you can disseminate to students who are not going to come to your program but will watch that video that you snap to them, or that you email out or text out or put on your portal behind a single sign-on as an example. How you deliver those resources is as important as the content of those resources. 67% of today's college student, I just read this the other day, said that they could not live without YouTube. That is one of their primary ways of accessing information, which is terrifying to those of us who work with student development, but it's also an opportunity. So we have started to send students, instead of sending them text emails about lots of things, we're sending them short videos. And whenever possible, our students are the talent for those videos. And they co-write the script, so it's authentic. Everything from, today's the day to register for classes, to important information about affirmative consent and inviting them to programming. So think about how you deliver those messages too. I think it's important to do that intentional year-long programming and that you brand it and you market it as part of your overall anti-violence curriculum. Students connect to things that they recognize, and if they can recognize your logo for prevention programming, your color scheme, a tagline or language, that helps students connect to that type of programming when you deliver it in multiple modalities. I think it's also critical that you do specific programs.
Before the 15th, huh?
If someone on the call needs to mute their call, thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. So it's also important, I mentioned earlier that our students are coming from smaller families with more parental involvement, that we think about our prevention work with parents and guardians. I host a webinar for parents and students, parents and guardians, about our prevention practices and about our anti-violence prevention work. We do parent and family orientation, where we also do prevention work with our parents and families, and that has been a tremendous success at reaching out to those folks. When I was at Clark, which was primarily a residential institution, we did this work as well, and we would get hundreds and hundreds of parents every week on these calls, because they are investing in this work, and they are, according to Generation Z students, the number one concern for their parents is their safety. That is their number one concern. So it is important for them, as they're evaluating your campus, to think about how you're messaging these prevention efforts to them as well as to your students. And then I talk here about reimagining bystander training. And again, I know it's important that your learning outcomes for your bystander training are the same, and that fidelity is maintained. My recommendation here is that you consider your population and maybe even create bystander training opportunities for your commuter students who are seeing different things than maybe your residential students are, or for your non-traditional population. This past year, I created a bystander training for our frontline staff. So for all of our admins and folks that sit and interact with our students on a day-to-day basis, so that we could have them paying attention and thinking about and interacting with our students in a pro-social bystanding type of way. And that has been that's been critical in terms of getting good reports from frontline staff about concerns that they may have about students who they're interacting with. I talked a little bit about the importance of that population level programming and having that be mandatory, and I think that is also a critical piece to this. And then when you have challenges around certain populations, commuter, non-traditional, that you really tailor your message to ensure, and your content to the degree that you can, to make sure that those students are represented. Our first attempt at this 5 years ago, we had students saying, well, I'm 45 years old, you're making me do this program, and every single photograph in the online program that you had us do is someone who looks 18. I have children who look older than the pictures that you are trying to make feel like me. And so we've been really intentional in all of our outreach in posters and online photos, and how we customize our online prevention work to make sure that our students are represented, that the diversity of our students is represented, the type and age of our students are represented, and their stories and voices are represented in that customization. And I don't know what's capable for you on that customization, but we can do those short videos where our students can talk about their experiences as a way to sort of augment that programming. And that has been very successful to do that. And then I think I'm on my last slide here, and then we'll open it up for questions. But just another couple of best practices that your materials really should be easily accessible. Your online resources, again, for commuter students with hyperlinks, and whenever possible, pictures of responsible employees and your Title IX staff and in the frontline student affairs or prevention folks. I know that that's incredibly helpful for students who do not access your campus often, your physical campus. I know that many students who come onto campus will recognize me by the picture on our website, or recognize our mental health counselors by their photograph. It personalizes that information, and there's research out there that says it makes students more comfortable clicking and connecting if they can see you. And know what you look like. It makes that more relational for them. And again, that's the technological social media world that they live in, and that they experience. So not having a photograph of someone attached to their information is unusual for them, and it causes them to be skeptical of who's behind that email address or that clicking link. The other thing that we've done on our campus that I think is a best practice is make sure that your reporting options are visible and easy to find. They're not buried, behind so many layers of your website that if a student has a concern or they're worried or they want to report an incident, that they're able to do that in a welcoming, inclusive way. Curriculum infusion. That means talking to your faculty and your deans to try to get this information into the classroom. That has been an ongoing effort for us. Our faculty, once our faculty and staff were required to do their online prevention program, we actually got more buy-in as they could understand how they could be effective, and that included, again, having customized videos from current faculty who are already on board to talk about how they have infused pieces of prevention work into their classroom materials. Passive programming is critical on your campus. Again, if you're talking about commuter students, they may not stay for your programming. They may not be there at 10 o'clock at night when a lot of programming might happen on a residential campus. So make sure your hallways are full of your prevention messaging, and do as much passive programming as possible. For example, one of the programs we do on our campus here is a program called Empty Place at the Table that looks at domestic violence, and it's literally a table setting with information, and students can stop and read and access that. We put it in a high traffic area, and it's a very powerful display. We've done art gallery sessions around our prevention work. We've done, done the T-shirt project and hung those in our high traffic areas. So there are lots of ways to get folks that access your campus in very different ways or very short amount of time to get this information to them, on your physical campus location, as well as through your website or through email outreach efforts. And then the last thing I want to talk about is one of our newer efforts that's been incredibly effective. Again, we looked at that sort of developmental research and realized that our students were really struggling with how to talk to each other, in particular how to talk to each other around difficult issues. And we have created a difficult dialogue program on our campus that has been incredibly successful. And essentially what this does is it teaches our students how to talk with one another, how to engage in dialogue that is challenging, how to engage in dialogue across difference around topics like race and gender and power and religion, issues that it's hard to find common ground. So the way we talk about each other or talk with each other is the common ground. And our prevention efforts are embedded into this work. We've done entire weeks and months on gender and violence, and we bring the entire campus community together, faculty, staff, and students, and we get between 60 and 80 students at each dialogue session, and we run through a series of questions, and we create small dialogue circles, and students talk through these issues. And it's amazing to see how you can transform culture by teaching people how to sit with one another and be uncomfortable, but have good, positive, productive, and respectful conversation and dialogue. And we've been able to create students and faculty as dialogue fellows, so this is now being entirely run by our students. So our students are the ones who are bringing folks together and leading these dialogue circles on these very sensitive and difficult topics. And it is, and then it has this contagion effect on our campus community of changing the way folks interact with one another. And it's been incredibly helpful, and I can certainly share some training materials with folks around how we've started that program, really to address the fact that students are disconnected. How do we reconnect them? And we believe that in order for our students to be successful out in the workforce and when they transfer to a four-year institution, that they have to have those relational skills in order to make it. So that's why we started that particular program as part of our prevention efforts. So with that, I'm going to take a breath and a drink of water and open it up for questions on the chat board. So you can start firing away on the chat board, and I'll pay attention to those and sort of take them as they come. I think we just have to make sure that you're chatting maybe to the whole group so that folks can see that question. Sure, I can repeat the statistics around what happens in 1 minute, and since we have some time, I have even more. So I'll take it slow and give these to you because I think they're, and again, I can send this to folks as well. But what happens in 1 internet minute? 973 Facebook logins, 18 million text messages, 4.3 million YouTube videos viewed, 375,000 apps are downloaded, 481,000 tweets are sent. The stat that really rattles me is 1.1 million swipes on Tinder. 187 million emails are sent. 25,000 GIFs are sent via Messenger, so that's GIFs. 2.4 million snaps are sent. $862,000 are spent online every minute. And 266,000 hours of Netflix is watched in 1 minute, in 1 internet minute. So it's pretty outstanding statistics. And this was created by a researcher named Lori Lewis, Lorilewiss. Oh, sure, Sarah. I will chat my email address right in the box, and I'm happy to send you our dialogue programming. We've had great success in bringing folks together. And again, we had a lot of folks on our campus who thought that program was not going to work. And we averaged 60 to 80 faculty, staff, and students per program, which is outstanding for our type of programming. And I really believe it's because of how we set that up. And it's small groups of folks talking with one another respectfully. So again, the training is on teaching folks in a very short amount of time how to talk with one another. There are some dialogue guidelines around how to engage with one another, and we put slides up in the room so that there's sort of the dialogue guidelines are there for them to see, and our dialogue facilitators make sure that happens. But what it does is it establishes voice in everyone in the room. So the way it works is that everyone contributes something. Everyone gets to talk in their small group. And one of the things that we see in our evaluations, and again, our students in the breadth of the students who attend these workshops is phenomenal to see. Our students are learning from one another, and they have tremendously different life experiences. But the piece of feedback that we hear from them is that our students don't always feel visible. They go through their life feeling invisible. They have no voice. They're never in an environment where they feel okay to talk or where their opinion seems to matter. And in these dialogic circles, everyone's opinion matters because it's not about what you know, it's about what you feel, and it's about what you think. And we all have that capacity. You don't have to be an expert on any of these topics to talk about how it feels to live and breathe in our culture and our world on our campus. We give them questions that every attendee is an expert in answering. And that is an empowering feeling about how to be able to open yourself up to hearing from other folks with different life experiences, but also being able to communicate your own. We have a question on here about engaging parents and guardians. Was lack of access to computers and internet or time to go to campus an issue? Yes. Access to technology is a tremendous issue in our area. Not all parents and families have internet access. Not all of our parents and families, if they have internet access, have access to a reliable computer or machine. So we do try to do an on-campus event as well as those online events. And so our attendance actually in person for our parent and guardian is better if we're just looking at raw numbers than our online programming, but we still offer and do both. And what we try to do, again, like we're doing with this webinar, is to record it and make it available so that you can watch it, after the fact. How do we advertise to parents? We advertise through our students. We advertise whenever a parent or guardian comes to an event. So we have open houses. A lot of folks do. A lot of folks are engaging. Most campuses will even ask their student for their parent contact information. And that is, I hope, to build sort of that sort of secondary population. We do that here. We started doing that here about 4 years ago so that, not all of our students are relying on a parent or guardian. Some of them are a parent themselves, so that would be not applicable to them. But when it is applicable, we're gathering that information and we're pulsing that out. I've met with a lot of campuses who are using Facebook and other social media to build groups just for parents and guardians, where they're posting prevention messages and programming messages. I think that's a great idea. It's another way for parents to be at an appropriate distance, particularly parents of traditional age students, but still be seeing the great work that you're doing, which is kind of where they want to be. They want to be on the fringe and periphery. They know they need to be. The more you show them, the less likely they will be intrusive. So I've seen some really good work in campuses doing that. So I think that, will the PowerPoint be available for reference? I can send that to anyone. I was asked to do this and wanted to do this to get as much of this information out to you. So I'm happy to share anything and everything with all of you that you think would be effective for the work that you're doing, on your campuses or with your students. So please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. I did chat my email address there, and I'm happy to answer questions that folks have.
You can also contact me, and I can send you the PowerPoint. This
Great.
is Josie.
Thanks, Josie.
Sure.
Other questions?
Okay. Well, Jason did give his email address, so if you think of something later on and want to ask then, this is not a lost opportunity. You can always do that then. Okay, but
Absolutely.
I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for their participation today and joining us for this webinar. And Jason, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks, everybody. Good luck with your work.
Have a great day, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Jason. Bye.